Hello, this is Derek Taylor for HIST 141 US History since 1877. It's our second lecture for the semester. And it's a lecture on the conquest of the continent in the latter half of the 19th century, which I'm titling Settler Nation, Continental Designs, 1877 to 1900. It goes along with your chapter in the textbook. And so we're talking about in this lecture, in that chapter, is about the acquiring of territory throughout the Western territories from sea to shining sea, as the hymn goes, and how that came about and why it came about. And before I get into the actual lecture itself, I wanted to show you guys a few images. Take a look at these with you. The poster from your textbook, the Great West, and take a look at this. Take a look at the how it's being portrayed there. Take a look at the what's going on at the top there. You have settlers coming out west. You have people surveying land. You have steamships bringing people in. And in this, foreground, you have this lush land and stuff flowing with, milk and honey and in the biblical phrase, and a nice white picket fence, and there's sheep everywhere. And, what do you suppose this is for? Well, if you don't know, you can find out in your textbook. It's a poster for promoting immigration to the West. What's west of, well, what's west of what? I mean, west of the Eastern Seaboard, mostly. This is coming from the Eastern Seaboard of the United States, which is where the center of the country was in the 19th century, and still basically is in cultural terms in a lot of ways. But it's meant to give people, it's an idealization of the West. It's gonna be this great land to settle in everything, right? Take a look at the next one. A little poster here, not from your textbook, but an advertisement for the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railroad companies. And these railroad companies in the 19th century, as you're going to see, sold lands. You sell lands along the places where you're building the railroads. And Atchison, of course, Topeka refers to Atchison and Topeka, Kansas. Atchison was a railroad hub at one point in this state. Again, look at how and it says lands, big bold letters. You want some good land? Come on here. Start a farm on the prairie right here. Start in the woods. What woods? The same place after 6 years work in profit. Look at that. The same place after 10 years work in profit. Look at all the money you're going to make. Temperate climate, excellent health, pure and abundant water, good soil for wheat, corn, and fruit, the best stock in the country. Right? In Kansas, in the Great Plains. And I'm hinting here, this is an advertisement, right? This is supposed to be, a document that the best thing in the West, right? It's advertisement meant to entice you. By the way, look at the bottom. It's printed in Chicago. It says down there, but look at this language here. I didn't even pronounce this. Muxtonst Airtight B. Schmidt Deutscher something, Topeka, Kansas. It's obviously for a German company or a German business in Topeka. Immigration, German immigration, right? Big thing in the 19th century. Get immigrants to come out west. Why? We'll get to that in a second. But yeah, all these things go in here, promising all this good stuff in the West. A couple other images to show you. This is an image of a poster for Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Pioneer exhibition. And it says down the bottom, a realistic representation of the historic Battle of Summit Springs. I don't know anything about the Battle of Summit Springs, so don't ask me. But take a look at it, right? You have the Indians there fighting, got the tomahawk up there. You have the soldiers fighting back. There's a white woman about to be scalped, and the guy's going to try to go save him and all this stuff. Who is this for? An image like this. And by the way, I'm going through this stuff because you're going to use images for your first little assignment in a couple of weeks. Take a look at them. What are they for? What are they advertising, right? Buffalo Bill had his own Wild West show, which he had real Indians in it, by the way. We have late 19th century film footage of them doing their tribal dances and stuff. And I'll tell you, I'm going to let you go off the hook here, but this is a poster. It's meant to appeal to people back east. His show would tour back east. Again, so it's giving them an image of what the West is like, creating that myth. I don't necessarily, by the way, mean total falsehood when I say myth, but a representation of it, right? To sell to people back east. And then finally, again, also from your textbook, the cover for a dime store novel. If you know what dime novels are, again, with the 10-cent novels, cheap novels. You guys don't read novels, do you? Yeah, we don't read novels anymore. I'm reading one. I'm trying. Internet ruins reading. Let's put it that way. Anyway, but Indian novels, Ornament Company. And here you have a character whose name apparently is Crack Skull Bob, attacking an Indian, the savage Indian, et cetera, et cetera. And he's kind of terrified. He's got a knife in one hand, both hands, but he's about to get hit with looks like an axe. Apparently gonna get his skull cracked by Crack Skull Bob, right? Again, an image being sold of, American whatever, taming the savages, right? In the West. And so you have an image, again, probably for bigger markets. It could be in the West by that time, 1872, I don't know. But an image for a market to buy and sell. And so I'm going this lecture talking about all this because I present this to you as the settlement of if you want to call it settlement, you can call it other things, conquest would work as well. Calling it it's a continuation to me in some ways of Reconstruction. This idea of building a nation, which Reconstruction, again, turning something into a modern society, a modern democracy. Well, of course, you're going to do that out West, both in terms of taming the land, but also taming the natives, which they've been doing for a long time. Let's be clear. The United States government had been, well, even before there was a United States government, during the colonial era, there had been efforts to move west across the continent. But in this period, you get the image of the West that comes down to us, which again, I'm not saying some of it's partly true, as we're going to see. I don't mean to say all of it's a falsehood or all just an advertising gimmick, but it's there. You also had the creation of this idea of the frontier, which you're going to get in your reading from Major Problems, Chapter 2 on Western settlement, of the idea of the frontier as the sort of cradle of democracy, of individualistic farmers, homesteaders who went west, settled and tamed the land, women, virtuous women, tough men, John Wayne, et cetera, and where democracy triumphs, right, in a rough and tumble way. And again, this is an image that not just popular culture sends to people, but in that case, an historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, comes up with this idea of the frontier in American life. And in the 19th century, you'll read about that in Major Problems, as telling us, okay, this is how we're constructing the nation here, right? This is how how the United States is seeing itself as it builds that unified, as you're going to see, national territory and national economy. We'll come to that as well. And the reason why I'm calling this settler nation, just to explain that to you, is that the United States, along with a lot of other places around the world, are what are called settler societies. The term settler society just means European societies where they founded colonies not for the purpose of extracting wealth, but for actually having settlers in enough numbers to transplant their culture and their civilization to another place. And we'll get to this at the end of this lecture and talk about this. The United States is part of a global trend in the 19th century of settler societies, both conquering territory and corralling native peoples. So that's the genesis of the lecture. Now, what about the West? More specifically, I mentioned after the Civil War, the Republican governments during Reconstruction, even afterward, after 1877, had a plan to strengthen the national economy, to overcome market fluctuations that took place under previous regimes. And they felt that the failure to fund internal improvements in different regions of the country, especially railroads, led to the Civil War, led to the country being so disconnected economically speaking that they came to blows. This idea, by the way, predates the Republican regimes of the late 19th century, as I'll mention this. And so during the Civil War and after, the Republican dominated Congress made strenuous efforts to use federal power to build up United States manufacturing using tariffs, stuff like this, but also using massive public-private partnerships, giving money, land grants to, again, railroads are the big ones, to corporations to build infrastructure. Again, railroads are the big thing. And it peaks after the Civil War with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which we'll come to in a moment, which connects the country from end to end. And so railroads are transformative. These railroad companies transform economic life in this country by adopting a legal form, the corporation, which we'll come to next time, to raise capital in large amounts, and at the same time getting the federal government to pay for building the railroads, which they do. Again, I mentioned offering land grants, but also loans. The land grants, of course, they'd sell back to settlers, and other federal subsidies. And they made money by selling land to immigrants. And most people went west looking for opportunities, farming opportunities, but some were led into cities where, as you're going to see, a lot of people move when they go west because of the economic challenges of farming, and it's actually going to lead to the American West becoming the most urban section of the country very quickly. And so you have you have an effort by the federal government to boost the national economy, to make the territory of the United States one whole economic system in a way it hadn't been before. And this is why you're going to have, we'll just feed this into the next chapter when we come out of this, to whole sectors of the economy being dominated by these gigantic corporations. And so you're going to have that as something going forward as well. You're also going to have the government trying to turn the American economy into a player on the world markets. And they'll do this by tying the economy to the gold standard. We need to explain this. There hadn't been not been any international standard of exchange before, I think, the 1840s and 50s. If there was, it would be something like silver was the sort of coinage coming from places like South America or China, or South America. But because of the gold rush in California in the 1840s and then Australia later on, all of a sudden there's a lot more gold in the world. And so countries like Britain, the British Empire, France, and then the United States after the Civil War begin pegging their currencies to gold. And this idea is, well, there's a lot of reasons to do this. But it's partly, again, to make the American currency, again, more profitable in the international markets. It also becomes a divisive issue at home because all of a sudden, poor small farmers don't have access to gold, and so it devalues their holdings, and so it's going to become a concern of the populists later on in the century. And so you're going to have this national plan the Republicans have, including the West, and so it's going to be constructed in some ways within this framework of government control and power. And as I said before, it has to do partly with trying to achieve greater leverage vis-a-vis nations like the British Empire, like France, like other global colonial powers, to be honest with you. American expansionists were expecting to add more territories to the country. You're going to see this later in the 18th century. The United States is going to add territory at the end of the 19th century in a couple of chapters. You're going to have increased trade with Latin America after the Union victory and after the Reconstruction. The United States will become very invested in Latin America for a variety of reasons in the late 19th and late 20th centuries. And international trade becomes a sort of way of asserting your dominance in this sort of global competition that goes underway, which the United States is going to get into both in Latin America, but also Asia in the latter part of the 19th century. And one of the ways they do this is to acquire territory. One of the ways they do is they acquire Alaska from Russia in 1868. the Secretary of State, William Seward, this was his idea to get strategic, places where they can, bases where their naval vessels can refuel and, trade can go on into the Pacific. And the same year, the United States also signed a treaty with China, the Burlingame Treaty, which is unique and significant. And it's significant because it allows a certain amount of workers to come in the United States from China. Why? Because the railroad companies want cheaper labor than they want to pay workers less than the native ones in America will work. So they bring in laborers from China. And it's significant also because this is the first time the federal government has ever, at least through statute that I'm aware of, regulated immigration. There was no federal regulation of immigration before 1868. But as they're trying to build this national market, build it into a nation state like other nation states, all of a sudden they do this. And of course, they want to pass the cost. They want to unburden companies of the cost of labor. So you get people who work for less. And that would be immigrants like the Chinese. Here's just a few maps to show you how this is happening. This is the growth of the railroad companies, or excuse me, railroad lines. You can see this. The red ones are already there, already existing, or excuse me, added in 1870 to 1890. As you can see, there's major ones already mostly in the Eastern and upper Midwest, but you can see how it expands in that 20-year period from 1870 to 1890, crisscrossing the country and creating, again, a much more integrated, what's the word? Supply chain, right? That's the thing today, supply chain. We can't get the stuff we want at the store because of supply chain. Well, this is the first time they're building it. They also, of course, this is one of the major feats of the post-war period is the Transcontinental Railroad. There were already plans for a railroad to crisscross the West before the Civil War. It's part of what sort of contributed to tensions, actually, where that railroad was supposed to go through. But they start building it in 1865, start in Omaha, wind up going all the way to, well, it goes all the way to Sacramento. They meet in the middle, do the Union Pacific from the east and the Central Pacific from the west in Promontory Summit, Utah. And they drive a golden spike through the ground, if you know the story. But again, the idea of connecting this entire continent, right? Settling the entire continent, making it one thing is a very big issue with these. This is why I connected to Reconstruction, right? To make it one real nation state that's not disconnected the way it was before the Civil War. One of the things to note about this is that this is something that's going on elsewhere in the world. The United States is the first country to complete a transcontinental railroad in 1869. It is followed thereafter, first by the Canadians in 1885. They have theirs. But then in 1903, the Russians connect the Trans-Siberian Railroad all the way from St. Petersburg up on the Baltic Sea, there going down through, it has lines for Moscow and everything else, all the way out to Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean, which was also, by the way, I should mention, was pitched. The Russian committee that came up with this idea, I'm quoting here, says, declared at the beginning of the construction of it in 1887, quote, "The Siberian Railway construction is a great national event. It should be built by Russian people with Russian materials," right? So these are expressions of nationalism in the 19th century. This is the great age of, building one single nation, one nation, one language, one government, all that stuff is very much a part of what's going on. Even in a place like Russia, which is not technically a settler society, they actually did expanded east in the 18th century and already settled their continent. But it's a similar process, even though it was already sort of completed there across other parts of the world. So that's the sort of general plan of this. So who's actually settling the West? Well, basically big corporations and laborers. And you're talking about the development of the West in terms of it'll become a foundation for, the United States, supremacy in the world markets later on. And of course, developing farmland in the middle of the country is a huge thing. And it's going to be mostly, cattlemen, miners, other laborers that do the work, railroad workers. But you're going to have big corporations. Big corporations are going to be huge for settling the West. Corporate ranchers, obviously, farming even in the 1800s is a big business. But you're also going to have, I guess I mentioned before, native and immigrant laborers going out there. So there's a class divide here, right? It's going to feed into, I mentioned mine workers. Mine workers, you'll see that in one of your sources in the Major Problems book. Native workers being not liking immigrant laborers because they work for more money and won't help them strike. But the mines of the far west in Colorado, especially silver mines, other types of mines, are going to be places of serious labor conflict in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Bloody conflict. People are going to get killed. So, because they're going to be, dangerous working conditions, not getting paid much. They strike. The companies fight back. Again, you didn't grow up with this stuff, and I didn't either. We came after this, but for a long time, people don't know about labor history in the United States was really rough. In any case, so they're having to produce in these in the West, fuel and food for cities, because you're going to have, again, it's become very urbanized very quickly. And they're also producing food almost immediately for a global market. Things like sheep raising become a major enterprise in the Rockies and the Sierra Mountain ranges. Ranching in the West from the beginning is part of a global industry shaped by big corporations. And so you're going to have a lot of the term your textbook uses is economies of scale, meaning that in order to compete in this environment, you almost have to be huge and humongous. This is something that is basically almost wiped out small farmers today. They're still around, but even in the 19th century, it was a difficult thing to compete in that marketplace because of this. And so you also have, of course, people coming out in the 19th century, individual farmers, homesteaders. And again, this was also part of Republican policy. They passed the Homestead Act in 1862, trying to bring families west by offering 162 acres of land. And I mentioned that those advertisements, they actually the United States government actually conducted advertising campaigns in Europe, in Northern Europe, people from Scandinavia coming and settling places like Minnesota, and places like this, Germans coming to New Kansas and places like this, all with the lure of what was supposed to be good, cheap land. And of course, as they turned out, it got here, it wasn't actually that easy to farm. And this is where you get the whole term American fever, because immigrants are being, they're being lured, to the United States, the promise of land. Why? Well, because people, I think, back east actually knew what the land was like and didn't want to come out and settle that much. And it's an interesting thing, that one of the things we're going to get to in later chapters, later discussions, is the development of an advertising industry in the United States, which happens by the end of the century. But here you have the federal government already beating them to the punch during the Civil War. So you have that stream of laborers coming out west. You do have people coming from east to the west who are already, native born or whatever. All looking for a better life, but not always finding it, is the point. But you also have people fleeing the South, African Americans, the so-called exodusters in the late 1870s. Exodusters are African Americans who are fleeing, as we'll get to a couple of chapters later, I guess, in the textbook, but fleeing, the creation of segregation in the South following the end of Reconstruction, following, laws to take away their voting rights and separate them from whites. And they flee to places like Kansas. There was a town in Kansas called Nicodemus, Kansas, which was an all African-American town. There was a neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas. I believe it's called Tennessee Town, because all the people came from Nashville, Tennessee in the late 1879-ish. I don't have the dates in front of me, but something like that. So you have those types of people in the latter part of this trek. You also have, of course, Mormons out west. You have Mormons who settled there before the Civil War. They create their own territory out there. They actually come into conflict with the federal government at one point. Do Mormon militias? Mormons were, if you don't know, driven out of Illinois violently, and so they were rather touchy about outsiders, and so they have militias running around, armed ones, who get into conflicts with federal troops later on. So it's a wild, wild place. The people who settle the West and what they do. So you have this. So you have this great mix of people. It's something to keep in mind how mixed the population is. It's already mixed in the Eastern Seaboard because of immigration, but it's going to be even more weird in some ways as you get out west into the middle states and then to the far west. And then finally, I can't stress enough just how much the federal government, the role it played here. Again, you have, railroads, land speculators, steamship lines, all trying to encourage this, but the land couldn't have been settled in most of the West without the federal government. New technologies like steel plows, barbed wire, different strains of wheat were needed to even settle some of these places. And in fact, in the early 1880s, settlers experienced exceptionally wet weather in the Great Plains. And then all the dry weather, or the normal dry weather, returned, and a lot of settlers basically went back because everything collapsed. But in fact, you're going to have in a lot of the actual work being done by big corporations, again, because laborers can't quite compete in this environment with these gigantic corporations, who in this vast movement of peoples, it's just too hard to compete, right? And so the big economies of scale basically drive a lot of farmers out of business. This is partly where you're going to get the populist movement coming from later on. And so it's a battle for resources out west. This is something interesting to keep in mind because, again, a lot of the land out west, west, you get farther than the Great Plains, is desert. It's stuff people really can't farm without large-scale irrigation. In 1879, the United States created the U.S. Department of the Interior, and they actually sent a guy out named John Wesley Powell. It's a one-armed Civil War veteran, a geologist, who went out west to explore federal lands during the Civil War. And he wrote a report in 1878 called Report on the Lands of the Arid Regions of the United States. And he told Congress that 160-acre tracts would not work in dry regions. Again, 160-acre tracts is what they tried to sell the Great Plains of. And said he encouraged smaller irrigated farms. And he proposed that the government work to develop water resources in the West. That is to say, build dams and canals, because otherwise you couldn't really farm there. Initially, Congress rejected the plan, but it was later considered a very good critique of the problems that existed out with the development of the plains and West. The Desert Land Act actually called for, that was passed in 1877, allowed for 640-acre parcels at 20 cents an acre to be sold. But again, water remained the big issue. Until 1902, they actually established something called the Bureau of Water Reclamation to fund water irrigation in 16 states, vastly increasing the amount of power the federal government has over these places. And like I said before, to repeat this, it's the only way it would have worked. You can't get people to settle places like Arizona. It's a freaking desert. Even a place like out in California, Los Angeles, right? It's desert. That you need water, you need irrigation. And for companies, they couldn't have done it on their own. You needed the power of the state to step in and fund a lot of this stuff. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I'm thinking back to LA. I believe the film Chinatown is actually based on this. It has to do with a dam project or something. It's an old movie, don't worry about it. But this idea is something that's real fundamental to the West. It leads to debates that we still grapple with over corporate versus small family farms. And so eventually what's going to happen in the latter part of the 19th century is that this sort of overdevelopment is going to lead to a preservation movement coming into Congress. By the 1870s, they had already set aside 2 million acres of Wyoming's Yellowstone Valley as a public park, partly for tourism, but also as you get later into the 19th, early 20th century, preservationists are going to push the federal government to create a national park system for other reasons. People like Theodore Roosevelt is concerned about losing natural resources. Again, this is a nationalist thing. The settlement of the West, they're concerned about losing timber, losing, land that might have oil and resources on it and stuff like this. And so this is going to happen with, the eviction of Indians from their lands. They can actually produce these parks in the 1870s and 80s. So one more map just to give you an idea of all this, to wrap up that thought about the lands of the West. I mean, just take a look at it. Tall grass, long grass. I mean, in some ways, the Great Plain is it's the Great Grass Desert, if I'm not mistaken, is what it's called. Look at all this arid territory here. Desert sagebrush, creosote brush down here. I mean, it's unlivable. There wouldn't be people there in a lot of these states, in parts of Utah or Colorado, without, again, water provided by the federal government. Excuse me. And so it required national efforts for all and I don't mean, by the way, again, I didn't mean to make that sound like these individual settlers were like it was a total awful experience, or there wasn't a lot of, individual effort to settle these areas, but you needed that kind of investment to even make it happen. People weren't going to move there voluntarily. They barely did. They had to trick a bunch of Europeans into coming there. Even though, again, the immigrants have, powerful stories in themselves. If you're ever familiar with the works of Willa Cather, the novelist, she writes novels about immigrants in Nebraska and stuff like that. It's a great novelist. But it happens, their lives happen, these individual lives, in the framework of this type of national movement to construct the West. And then finally, most tragically, this settlement of the nation couldn't happen without, maybe it's a little too literal there, war against Native peoples, but it basically is. It's basically against the Plains Indians, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, all the great Indians of the middle part of the country at that point. Before the Civil War, Congress had given the Great Plains to Native Americans because they didn't think it could be farmed. The development of different technologies, the spread of the railroads changed that. And in fact, the Civil War created conditions for conflict, because all of a sudden during the Civil War, they had to call, troops who were on the border, all out in the plains back east to go fight. And this left settlers out there vulnerable, no oversight. They could either be attacked by Indians or they go attack them themselves, which would create problems. And so it's led to conflict. In 1862, the Sioux and other tribes who had been forced onto reservations in some regards, some places where, by the way, they were supposed to farm, they didn't know how to do that, where they were starving in some conditions, planned a reprisal attack on the federal government. They massacred 400 white settlers in 1862, leading to flight and hysteria. So you have all these settlers coming back to the forts, begging the government to do something, which they do. They hunt down the ringleaders, and they execute 38 of them. This is the largest federal execution in U.S. history. Abe Lincoln signs off on this, and they exile the rest of the Sioux from the state of Minnesota because of that. At the same time, the Dakota Sioux are escalating tension. There are escalating tensions between the Dakota Sioux and the government in 1864. One colonel named Shivington led his troops to commit a massacre in Wyoming and Cheyenne, in eastern Colorado, I should say. While the braves of the Cheyenne were out, they went into an unarmed village and killed a bunch of women and children. Pretty awful stuff. Same time, the Sioux and also the Arapaho responded with more attacks in December of 1866 in Wyoming. They wiped out 80 men under the command of a captain and successfully closed off the Bozeman Trail in Wyoming. So they fought them to a standstill by the end of that year. Within a few years, by 1869, public opinion was beginning to turn against all this warfare. And so the federal government began to search for different options to deal with this so-called Indian problem. And the idea they came up with in terms of Grant's peace policy is one of assimilation. And it's kind of interesting. This policy of his was heavily influenced by Christian reformers in his administration. And by reformers, I mean these have been Christian abolitionists, slavery abolitionists before the war. And they argued, these reformers did, that Indians could be transformed into, essentially white American citizens through education and religious teaching, religious indoctrination in boarding schools. And so they start opening boarding schools in 1879. First one opens at Carlisle. I don't know what state that's in 1879. And again, this is something that took place in other countries, places like Canada. If you maybe heard in the news the last 6 months or so, there was a big scandal because they found what they thought were bodies of Native Americans at the sites of former Catholic boarding schools up in Canada. Turns out they didn't actually find what they thought they found. There weren't actually any bodies excavated. But it is true in both of these countries, and I think in Australia as well, you had religious institutions, Protestant, Catholic mostly, setting up boarding schools where the government would force these Indians to go there with the whole purpose of basically bleeding their customs and traditions out of them. I think in your textbook you have a little insert of the experience of one Native American woman who was forced to cut her hair, forced to wear European clothing and stuff like this. And I should stress, these people were well-intentioned, the people who came up with these ideas, but things like corruption was rampant everywhere in the late 19th century. But also, of course, prejudice, racism, but also infighting between Protestants and Catholics reduced the effectiveness in some ways of this campaign. And I should stress, by the way, you did have prior to the Civil War, like the Shawnee Indian Mission over in, I forget, I've been there, I know where it's at. There's a museum there today. There had been missions earlier than this, which were essentially voluntary. The Indians would come voluntarily. Again, this is partly a policy meant to sort of force this on them in the late 19th century. And the federal government began taking away powers of these tribes in other ways. Congress in 1871 abolished any sort of further treaty making with the Indian tribes. By 1903, the Supreme Court had basically ruled in a court case called Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock that Congress could make any policies it chose with regards to the Indians and ignore existing treaties. And that same year, in another Supreme Court case, Ex parte Crow Dog, the Supreme Court ruled that Indians were not citizens unless explicitly approved as such by Congress. So it basically made them wards of the state unless they got congressional say-so. Another attempt at assimilation that was tried was the so-called Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which promised land to Indians. The idea was to sort of inure them to private property. You have to remember, in these tribal settlements, their native habitat, as it were, the Indians didn't have private property in the same way Europeans did. And so the idea of the Dawes Severalty Act is that all Indians would receive allotments, plots of reservation land, and the remainder would be sold off to non-Indians. And so they would have property as individuals rather than as tribes. Again, all of this basically was doomed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was corrupt, careless, and greedy. 15 million surplus acres were taken from tribes in the Indian Territory by 1994, which was what became the state of Oklahoma. Before the Dawes Act, Indians had held over 155 million acres of land. By 1900, this was 77 million. And by 1934, Native peoples had lost 66% of lands that had been originally allotted to them. So a lot of good intentions, but just bad actors were responsible for a lot of this. And again, from a distance, we can kind of see the tragedy that nobody thought that, hey, let me let them keep their customs, maybe, even if they become, citizens. Although you can ask, it's a question to ask, you know, a modern industrialized nation was spreading across the country. Could they even have, if they wanted to, save the Indians' way of life? It's a question for discussion, perhaps. I don't know. And then finally, there were several, attempts at resistance. In 1873, Sitting Bull, the great Lakota Sioux leader, was the only one who openly refused to go to a reservation. The federal government was demanding that the Sioux meet at federal agencies to come see them about things. They decided to fight back, particularly in 1876, when the Sioux refused to sell the Black Hills of South Dakota because the federal government wanted the land because they discovered gold there. And so, of course, in June of 1876, George A. Custer, with some of his men, pursued a war party of Chief Crazy Horse, who was sent out to trap him, which they did. And they were slaughtered to a man by Sioux and Cheyenne warriors at Little Bighorn. This became a sort of catastrophe back east. It was a sort of rallying cry for the U.S. Army. But it was the last victory that the Plains Indians ever win against the U.S. Army, a sort of a Pyrrhic victory. And by the next year, the Nez Perce are already beginning to be the war with the Nez Perce has started. And as well, you have the Apache beginning to fight back, who settled in the Southwest. Life is miserable there for them. They leave their reservations, start attacking white settlers, and commit atrocities against them. And they're eventually hunted down, and their leader, Geronimo, is captured in 1886. Despite living on reservations, the Indians tried to continue to practice traditional languages, ceremonies, customs. Most Native peoples tried to selectively adopt European ways in order to blend the two together. However, there was one sort of last flare-up end of the 1880s, 1890s. There was the appearance of something called the ghost dance throughout reservations in the North. A blending together of European and Indian religion drew on Christian and Native elements, and it spread from reservation to reservation across the West. You had, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, I don't have it in my notes, one Indian sort of, prophesying, making prophecies that sort of spooked the local whites there. And so the ghost dance frightened local settlers. And on December 29th, 1890, at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, U.S. Army soldiers massacred 150 Lakota Sioux. The soldiers were afraid the ghost dance would provoke a war, and so wound up killing a bunch of innocent people. And so more or less by 1890, they've been put onto reservations and cowed under. So just finally, one last map. It's in your textbook, just to make it clear, what we're talking about when it happens. You can kind of see all the dark red, that's stuff that's already been sort of claimed before 1850. Between 1850 and 1870, you can see large swaths of this land is taken already. California, up in the Northwest, Texas. The last events are between 1870 and 1890, basically the Sioux up in the Great North and Nez Perce. They surrender. Chief Joseph does in 1877. And then down in the Southwest, the Apache, the last centers of resistance in the 1870s. And so finally, by the end of the century, the United States, expanded from coast to coast, from east to the Pacific, had 40 states, had an industrial economy that was built up during this period, that were becoming the most powerful in the world at that point, actually, and had, was becoming a great power in its own right, partly through the subduing of these lands and these peoples. And it's part of, again, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of this lecture, to return to this, part of this movement in places like Australia. The Aboriginal peoples there are conquered by settlers in Australia. Same thing happens in Canada, Latin America, places like Argentina and other places in the Southern Cone. Their native peoples are subdued. South Africa, natives there, part of the British Empire. They all subdue indigenous populations. They all require both internal and external migrations. That's the other thing that happens in the United States. You're going to have massive amounts of immigration from Western Europe coming in. You're going to have massive amounts of immigration going to places in Australia, Latin America, Europeans on the move, Chinese coming to the United States, people from Mexico coming to the United States as well. And all this is part of that process of European state formation that I talked about last time, the Reconstruction. It's part of a global construction of a nation state, which, as you've seen as well, I mentioned internal migrations. It means people already here are moving from east to west, the Midwest to the West. It means the mobilization of big companies, big, massive amounts of capital who need lots of labor. And so it's the beginning, it'll be the beginning of, I'm mentioning class a lot in this. You have all sorts of classes, not just, working class. You think European origins, you're having immigrants, you're having native peoples, freed African Americans now, the exodusters, all being sort of part of this growth and expansion of the state in the 19th century, forging, as your textbook says, a transcontinental nation. So that is a lecture for this last lecture for this week. So we guys get your questions up before we have a discussion. We'll talk about Reconstruction and conquering the West in next time. So take care. I'll see you guys then.